sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no sycophantic losers, and there'll be no boys stuck down the well. There'll be no mama's little dysfunction. There'll be no peace this side of hell. There'll be no traitors on the wall. There'll be no wolf in mother's dress. Sex, love, money, and death. Sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no swine to disappoint you. There'll be no meat that keeps you thin. There'll be no rumbles in the bedrooms of the thick. There'll be no cage to keep them in. There'll be no clairvoyant patrol. There'll be no graves for you to test. Sex, love, money, and death. Sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no switch to make you happy. There'll be no book that makes you free. There'll be no loopholes that they won't have already filled. There'll be no money on the gum tree. There'll be no consequential crime, no law and order on request. Sex, love, money, and death. Sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no haunted televisual process, and there'll be no cackle in the night. There'll be no werewolf apparitions in a jar. No spirits here, just out of sight. No doctor jabbering, more salvation. No surreal and insane injustice. Sex, love, money, and death. Sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no words with which to tempt you. There'll be no visions in the sky. There'll be no hunter on your trail to make you nervous. There'll be no sympathy when you cry. There'll be no system you can speak of, no millionaire to buy your rest. Sex, love, money, and death. Sex, love, money, and death. There'll be no cyanide invitation. There'll be no secret police to fool. There'll be no hunchback indiscretion. There'll be no judgment for the cruel.